coming back to this. Lee, can I ask Lee to come forward now and give his presentation?
Yes. Well, thank you. I was invited to do this simply because Michael had heard that I'd read Kenilworth many times. But like the Earl of Leicester, I too have a secret. I've not been to university. I'm not credible, really, to give you an in-depth discussion and a dissection of this novel. So what does it mean to me? The reason I volunteered is because this novel reminds me of a truly great friendship, and every time I read it, I have that connection to a friendship long gone. So I need to give you a little bit of the background as to how that came about. As Iain has alluded, I came up to Edinburgh some 25 years ago, and I sought out the Edinburgh Sir Walter Scott Club simply because a mysterious thing occurred when I was working in Manchester that led me to Walter Scott, that I clung to him for dear life. And when I came up to Edinburgh, I sought out the Scott Club, and as you have too, joined and enjoying the club in all its glories. But the secretary at the time, one Fraser Elgin, had heard that I was struggling to complete my collection and arranged a meeting in this very building. And I was amazed at this man's knowledge and the fact that he had travelled the world so much, that he was fluent in many languages, and he was also amazed at the fact that I was keen on Scott and being so young. So a friendship developed at that time. He hooked me into the club because he saw I was the youngest, and he knew that I would be able to carry the can. And I asked him if he would become my mentor, as a business mentor that was at the time. In fact, that actually didn't occur straight away. It was this novel that preceded this. So I met Fraser a couple of times in order to learn the accounts, because that's the job he wanted me to do. And it was on that occasion when I discovered that he was fluent in Latin and Russian and Greek and French and so many other languages. And I said to him, look, I'm really struggling with my edition, because it wasn't the Edinburgh edition, to make sense of the Latin. And he said, right, well, I'll meet up with you. And the friendship blossomed over several years before I was married, where he'd come round to the flat I was renting round the corner here, and I'd cook up a meal, and after the meal we'd sit down and we'd both take a chapter or a page, and we'd spend 4 or 5 hours every Sunday reading, starting with Kenilworth, and then he'd go over the Latin. And he thought this would be easy to teach a scoundrel from Salford Latin, but once he discovered that I couldn't even do basic English grammar, we had to scupper that and go back to basics. But that didn't deter him. And he had a drink of water already. And so over the next 16 years until his death, I continued to meet up with Fraser. And even though he had dementia latterly, I was able to read to him, and he kind of appreciated that. But I don't forget the times when, for many years, every day, every Sunday, religiously, we sat and read and enjoyed Kenilworth, and it helped polish my character in a way, because I discovered there was many words that I was pronouncing incorrectly, and he helped me. He didn't want me to embarrass myself in public. Turning to the story itself, though, the reason I like it so much, as Iain has already said, is that it doesn't start with a detailed history, which you find you have to get embroiled into before you get to the action. I think Scott may have learnt from the mistakes of his previous novels, because it doesn't go into that detail until he gets to like page 80 in the book, when he gives you the background. So it's great that you've got a novel that hits the ground running and has such a good pace. The pace continues, I'm sure you've all read it, and the only hindrance I believe is with this novel is that when he has to go in search of, to get his horse shoed, I think that is the only time it really slows down, but he's introducing necessary characters, such as Flibbertigibbet and Wayland Smith, and I can see his purpose for doing that, but that, to me, that's the only point where he really slows down the pace of the novel. I like it also for the sheer volume of humour. Even in the first chapter, Goldthread is a comedian, and he really does make me laugh, and I savour reading those words, because it's the detail, and it's that language that I don't think any other author is capable of writing in that style. Scott brings us, with his descriptions, into an immediate present. We're sharing the characters' feelings in ways that I've never read in any other author. And other than the Latin, I do find it really easy to read. And thankfully, with the Edinburgh edition, I can quickly flick to the back and get to the bits that I don't understand. But Scott in general, to me, he's a man like no other, predominantly because of his style. I think if he wasn't an author, I could only imagine that he would be some a psychologist or a gossip columnist, because if you distill the characters in the ways he does, in fact, I haven't written down any examples because I didn't particularly wish to actually read from the novel. But how does he do it? How can he distill a character so distinctly? He's almost like a gossip, because he'll give you the lowdown on a person in depths in which you would probably even don't know yourself. And it makes me wonder how well Scott knew himself to be able to give a verdict of somebody else in so much detail. So yes, I think he'd make a great psychologist, because I would not like him to look into my soul, because and distill that on paper, because I'm sure I'd be very scared. So yes, it's the style, it's the language, and how it brings us into the present. He's a genius like no other. But also in this book, I think it's definitely the elements of fun he brings into it. And just also quoting from the first chapter, just the style of language here, it says, to quote, I forget his name now, I forgot the landlord, between misreckonings, miscarriages, mistakes and misdemeanours. I just love how he's having fun with words. The play there between mistakes, miscarriages, mistakes and misdemeanours. You know the line where he would have given the devil the key to keep. Yeah. And also, the thriftless, godless nephew adrift again. He would send his thriftless, godless nephew adrift again. He's having so much fun with this. And what amazes me is that Scott never repeats himself. He's a powerhouse beyond recognition. A pretty piece of painted Eve's flesh. He was absolutely, an absolute pure genius. And for those reasons, I really savour reading Scott, and in particular, reading Kenilworth. And if anybody comes to me and asks, do you recommend a novel, I will always recommend Kenilworth, simply because it is fast, there's no detailed history to try and get through at the start. And yes, there's a few classical allusions and Latin to decipher, but we have the Edinburgh edition which helps people get through it. So the reason I will continue to read Scott and continue to read Kenilworth is for that very reason. But I'm sure all of you in this room who've read it cannot forget that the defining moment when Elizabeth discovers the truth. Do you remember that in the story, just before the end? How Scott was able to write that piece, to portray this woman who's very thoughtful and powerful, and portray it in a manner where she doesn't completely lose it, but you know she wants to. I think it's writing beyond excellence. So I will always continue to read Scott. I'm grateful for the Walter Scott Club and giving me a friendship that endured until Fraser died. And thank you for allowing me to give you my version of why I enjoyed the novel. Thank you. Yeah, I think it answered your question as well, but I think it was just bitter. I mean, in one word. That's probably the reason why he wanted that to happen, because he had designs on her and he knew they wouldn't get fulfilled. I mean, there's multiple reasons why he wanted her out of the way so he could obviously be the king's lackey, but he wanted her for himself. At the start, he knew he had designs on her. So yeah, definitely a bitter and twisted individual at the end, I think. But interestingly, just can I add about Amy? I do like Walter Scott's female characters because most of them are fairly strong. But Amy's just this flip-flop, naive girl. Sometimes she's a spoilt brat, sometimes she's really grand and can control her emotions. But there are other times you just want to give her a shake and say, come on, it doesn't have to end like this. But we know the ending.